Hello, everybody, and welcome to our Read Aloud this week. We're going to finish up the adventures of Buster Bear today. So let's find out what happens with Buster Bear and Farmer Brown's boy. Chapter 20. Buster Bear carries off the pail of Farmer Brown's boy. The question is, did Buster Bear steal Farmer Brown's boy's pail? To steal is to take something which belongs to someone else. There is no doubt that he stole the berries that were in the pail when he found it, for he deliberately ate them. He knew well enough that someone must have picked them, for who ever heard of blueberries growing in tin pails? So there is no doubt that when Buster took them, he stole them. But with the pail, it was different. He took the pail, but he didn't mean to take it. In fact, he didn't want the pail at all. You see, it was this way. When Buster found that big tin pail brimming full of delicious berries in the shade of that big bush in the old pasture, he didn't stop to think whether or not he had a right to them. Buster is so fond of berries that from the very second that his greedy little eyes saw that pailful, he forgot everything but the feast that was waiting for him right under his very nose. He didn't think anything about the right or wrong of helping himself. Therefore, before him were more berries than he had ever seen together at one time in all his life. And all he had to do was eat and eat and eat. And that is just what he did. Of course, he upset the pail, but he didn't mind a little thing like that. When he had gobbled up all the berries that rolled out, he thrust his nose into the pail to get all that was left in it. Just then he heard a little noise, as if someone were coming. He threw up his head to listen, and somehow, he never did know just how, the handle of the pail slipped back over his ears and caught there. This was bad enough, but to make matters worse, just at that very minute he heard a shrill, angry shout. "Hi there! Get out of there!" He didn't need to be told whose voice that was. It was the voice of Farmer Brown's boy. Right then and there, Buster Bear nearly had a fit. There was that awful pail fast over his head so that he couldn't see a thing. Of course, that meant that he couldn't run away, which was the thing of all things he most wanted to do. For as big as he is and strong as he is, Buster is very shy and bashful when human beings are around. He growled and whined and squealed. He tried to back out of the pail and couldn't. He tried to shake it off and couldn't. He tried to pull it off, but somehow he couldn't get hold of it. Then there was another yell. If Buster hadn't been so frightened himself, he might have recognized that second yell as one of fright. For that is what it was. You see, Farmer Brown's boy had just discovered Buster Bear. When he had yelled the first time, he had supposed that it was one of the young cattle who lived in the old pasture all summer. But when he saw Buster, he was just as badly frightened as Buster himself. In fact, he was too surprised and frightened even to run. After that second yell, he just stood still and stared. Buster clawed at that awful thing on his head more frantically than ever. Suddenly it slipped off so that he could see. He gave one frightened look at Farmer Brown's boy, and then with a mighty woof, he started for the Green Forest as fast as his legs could take him. And this was very fast indeed. Let me tell you. He didn't stop to pick out a path, but just crashed through the bushes as if there were nothing at all. Just nothing at all. But the funniest thing of all is this. He took that pail with him. Yes, sir. Buster Bear ran away with the big tin pail of Farmer Brown's boy. You see, when it slipped off his head, the handle was still around his neck. And there he was, running away with a pail hanging from his neck. He didn't want it. He would have given anything to get rid of it. But he took it because he couldn't help it. And that brings us back to the question. Did Buster steal Farmer Brown's boy's pail? What do you think? Chapter 21. Sammy Jay makes things worse for Buster Bear. Thief! 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 Sammy Jay was screaming at the top of his lungs as he followed Buster Bear across the old pasture toward the green forest. Never had he screamed so loud, and never had his voice sounded so excited. The little people of the green forest, the green meadows, and the smiling pool are so used to hearing Sammy cry thief that usually they think very little of it. But every blessed one who heard Sammy this morning stopped whatever he was doing and pricked up his ears to listen. Sammy's cousin Blacky the Crow just happened to be flying along the edge of the old pasture, and the minute he heard Sammy's voice, he turned and flew over to see what it was all about. Just as soon as he caught sight of Buster Bear running for the green forest, as hard as ever he could, he understood what had excited Sammy so. He was so surprised that he almost forgot to keep his wings moving. Buster Bear had what looked to Blacky very much like a tin pail hanging from his neck. No wonder Sammy was excited. Blacky beat his wings fiercely and started after Sammy. So they reached the edge of the green forest. Buster Bear running as hard as ever he could, Sammy Jay flying just behind him and screaming, "Thief! Thief! Thief!" at the top of his lungs. And behind him, Blacky the Crow trying to catch up and yelling as loud as he could, "Caw, caw, caw! Come on, everybody! Come on, come on!" Poor Buster! It was bad enough to be frightened almost to death as he had been caught up in the old pasture when the pail had caught over his head, just as Farmer Brown's boy had yelled at him. Then to have the handle of the pail slip down around his neck so that he couldn't get rid of the pail, but had to take it with him as he ran, was making a bad matter worse. Now, to have all his neighbors of the green forest see him in such a fix and make fun of him was more than he could stand. He felt humiliated. That is just another way of saying shamed. Yes, sir, Buster felt that he was shamed in the eyes of his neighbors, and he wanted nothing so much as to get away from himself, where no one could see him, and try to get rid of that dreadful pail. But Buster is so big that it is not easy for him to find a hiding place. So when he reached the green forest, he kept right on to the deepest, darkest, most lonesome part and crept under the thickest hemlock tree he could find. But it was no use. The sharp eyes of Sammy Jay and Blacky the Crow saw him. They actually flew into the very tree under which he was hiding. And how they did scream! Pretty soon Ol' Mistah Buzzard came dropping down out of the blue, blue sky and took a seat on a convenient dead tree, where he could see all that went on. Ol' Mistah Buzzard began to grin as soon as he saw that tin pail on Buster's neck. Then came others. Redtail the Hawk, Scrapper the Kingbird, Redwing the Blackbird, Drummer the Woodpecker, Welcome Robin, Tommy Tit the Chickadee, Jenny Wren, Redeye the Vireo, and ever so many more. They came from the old orchard, the green meadows, and even down by the Smiling Pool, for the voices of Sammy Jay and Blacky the Crow carried far. And at the sound of them, everybody hurried over, sure that something exciting was going on. Presently Buster heard light footsteps, and peeping out, he saw Billy Mink and Peter Rabbit and Jumper the Hare and Prickly Porky and Reddy Fox and Jimmy Skunk. Even timid little Whitefoot, the Wood Mouse, was there. He could peer out and see without being seen. Of course, Chatterer the Red Squirrel and Happy Jack the Gray Squirrel were there. There they all sat in a great circle around him, each where he felt safe, but where he could see, and every one of them laughing and making fun of Buster. "Thief! Thief! Thief!" screamed Sammy until his throat was sore. The worst of it was Buster knew that everybody knew that it was true. That awful pail was proof. "I wish I never had thought of berries," growled Buster to himself. Chapter 22. Buster Bear has a fit of temper. A temper is a bad, bad thing. When once it gets away, there's nothing quite at all like it to spoil a pleasant day. Buster Bear was in a terrible temper. Yes, sir, Buster Bear was having the worst fit of temper ever seen in the Green Forest. And the worst part of it all was that all his neighbors of the Green Forest and a whole lot from the Green Meadows and the Smiling Pool were also there to see it. It is bad enough to give way to temper when you are all alone, and there is no one to watch you. But when you let temper get the best of you, right where others can see you, oh dear, dear, it certainly is a sorry sight. Now, ordinarily, Buster is one of the most good-natured persons in the world. It takes a great deal to rouse his temper. He isn't 1/10 so quick-tempered as Chatterer the Red Squirrel, or Sammy Jay, or Reddy Fox. But when his temper is aroused and gets away from him, then watch out. It seemed to Buster that he had had all that he could stand that day, and a little more. First had come the fright back there in the old pasture. Then the pail had slipped down behind his ears and held fast, so he had run all the way to the Green Forest with it hanging around his neck. This was bad enough, for he knew just how funny he must look. And besides, it was very uncomfortable. But to have Sammy Jay call everyone within hearing to come and see him was more than he could stand. It seemed to Buster as if everybody who lived in the Green Forest, on the Green Meadows, or around the Smiling Brook was sitting around his hiding place, laughing and making fun of him. It was more than any self-respecting bear could stand. With a roar of anger, Buster Bear charged out of his hiding place. He rushed this way and that way. He roared with all his might. He was very terrible to see. Those who could fly, flew. Those who could climb, climbed. And those who were swift of foot, ran. A few who could neither fly nor climb nor run fast hid and lay shaking and trembling for fear that Buster would find them. In less time than it takes to tell about it, Buster Bear was alone. At least, he couldn't see anyone. Then he vented his temper on the tin pail. He cuffed at it and pulled at it, and all the time growling angrily. He lay down and clawed at it with his hind feet. At last the handle broke, and he was free. He shook himself. Then he jumped on the helpless pail. With a blow of a big paw, he sent it scattering across a tree. He tried to bite it. Then he once more fell to knocking it this way and that way until it was pounded flat. And no one would ever have guessed that it had once been a pail. Then, and not until then, did Buster recover his usual good nature. Little by little, as he thought it all over, a look of shame crept into his face. I guess it wasn't the fault of that thing. I ought to have known enough to keep my head out of it, he said slowly and thoughtfully. You got no more than you deserve for stealing Farmer Brown's boy's berries, said Sammy Jay, who had come back and was looking on him from the top of a tree. You ought to know by this time that no good comes from stealing. Buster Bear looked up and grinned, and there was a twinkle in his eye. You ought to know, Sammy Jay, he said. I hope you'll always remember it. Thief, 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 screamed Sammy and flew away. Chapter 23. Farmer Brown's Boy Lunches on Berries. When things go wrong in spite of you, to smile the best thing you can do. To smile and say, I'm mighty glad, there are no worse, they're not so bad. That is what Farmer Brown's boy said when he found that Buster Bear had stolen the berries he had worked so hard to pick, and then had run off with his pail. You see, Farmer Brown's boy is learning to be something of a philosopher, one of those people who accept bad things cheerfully, and right away see how they are better than they might have been. When he had first heard someone in the bushes where he had hidden his pail of berries, he had been very sure that it was one of the cows or young cattle, who live in the old pasture during the summer. He had been afraid that they might stupidly kick over the pail and spill the berries. And he had hurried to drive whoever it was away. It hadn't entered his head that it could be anybody who would eat those berries. When he had yelled and Buster Bear had suddenly appeared, struggling to get off the pail which had caught over his head, Farmer Brown's boy had been too frightened to even move. Then he had seen Buster tear away through the brush, even more frightened than he was. And right away his courage had begun to come back. If he is so afraid of me, I guess I needn't be afraid of him, he said. I've lost my berries, but it is worth it to find out that he is afraid of me. There are plenty of more bushes, and all I've got to do is pick them. It might be worse. He walked over to the place where the pail had been, and then he remembered that when Buster ran away, he had carried the pail with him, hanging around his neck. He whistled. It was a comical little whistle, as he realized that he had nothing in which to put more berries, even if he picked them. It is worse than I thought, he cried. That bear has cheated me out of that berry pie my mother promised. Then he began to laugh as he thought of how funny Buster Bear had looked with the pail about his neck. And then, because, he is learning to be a philosopher, he once more repeated, it might have been worse. Yes, indeed, it might have been worse. That bear might have tried to eat me instead of the berries. I guess I'll go eat that lunch I left back by the spring, and then I'll go home. I can pick berries some other day. Chuckling happily over Buster Bear's great fright, Farmer Brown's boy tramped back to the spring where he had left 2 thick sandwiches on a flat stone when he started to save his pail of berries. My, but those sandwiches will taste good, he thought. I'm glad they are big and thick. I never was hungrier in my life. Hello? This he exclaimed right out loud, for he had just come in sight of the flat stone where the sandwiches should have been. And they were not there. No, sir. There wasn't so much as a crumb left of those 2 thick sandwiches. You see, Old Man Coyote had found them and gobbled them up while Farmer Brown's boy was away. But Farmer Brown's boy didn't know anything about Old Man Coyote. He rubbed his eyes and stared everywhere, even up in the trees, as if he thought those sandwiches might be hanging up there. They had disappeared as completely as if they never had been, and Old Man Coyote had taken care to leave no trace of his visit. Farmer Brown's boy gaped foolishly this way and that way. Then, instead of growing angry, a slow smile stole over his freckled face. I guess someone else was hungry too, he muttered. I wonder who it was. Guess this old pasture is no place for me today. I'll fill up on berries, and then I'll go home. So Farmer Brown's boy made his lunch on blueberries, and then, rather sheepishly, he started for home to tell of all the strange things that had happened to him in the old pasture. 2 or 3 times as he had trudged along, he stopped to scratch his head thoughtfully. I guess, he said at last, that I'm not so smart as I thought. And I've got a lot to learn yet. This is the end of the adventures of Buster Bear in this book, because, guess why? Because old Mr. Toad insists that I must write a book about his adventures. And old Mr. Toad is such a good friend that all of us that I'm going to do it. The end. So that's the end of The Adventures of Buster Bear by Thornton W. Burgess. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Tune in next week, and we're going to start The Adventures of Chatterer the Red Squirrel. So I hope you guys enjoyed our story reading. Bye.